Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone who's already presented. It's really, I'm not the first person to say this. It's really great to be someplace where I don't have to explain why this is worth talking about. That's usually like a third of the presentation. Let's get into some key terms here. I don't know how to think. Is it over or down? There we go. Yeah, normally this is like 5 to 10 minutes each. There is a term sort of missing here, a true line of sight, which would be a related actual rule from the game itself, right? Or different versions. If you're interested in that, you can find a paper I've written on that. This is an ongoing project, which means that I work very, very slowly. And I'm hoping to turn this into a full-fledged paper, so I'm desperate for feedback after this. And so consider this a blue-tacked mini that has not yet been glued together, something we'll be talking about. So I'm looking for critique. These practices make up things that we do at a couple of different tables, at the gaming table, right? But also, and here I'm trying to focus more on the hobby table. And you can think of where yours is, mine is in the basement. And for me, that's sort of fitting. Its subterranean location is because it is beneath notice in many ways. And while the whole world of Warhammer deserves much more work, it seems to me that bizarrely, this kind of primary foundational act, the putting together, yes, shopping first, right? But after that, this primary act of putting together seems to have gone uncommented on. In many ways, the symbol of the hobby is a like bent and wet paintbrush sticking out of a pot, right? And we can think to the golden demon with the monocle squinting, right? The paintbrush and painting is so iconic and well represented in our imagination, but glue, screws, files, these things kind of go unremarked on. Until now, I'm changing everything with this radical presentation. In this slide, you'll see some miniatures I painted. I just wanted to see them really big for once in my life. So that's why they're coming. But also, and many of you will recognize, and here's something to think about, these miniatures, but you can't buy them, right? Not as such. It is in converting in kit fashion that I think we can start to see ways in which modeling is not as clear cut as it might be, right? And this is not to denigrate the static pose, mono pose, marine holding its bolter like a teddy bear that we all know and love, nor the unconverted metal miniature, nor the plastic miniature assembled exactly as it shows it on the box. But rather, it's to talk about what I think is very common, and that's everything from just how you pose a multi-part miniature to the simple head swap or weapon swap to something like, here's an old metal miniature in which a plastic head has been put on after I kind of like rough chopped off its metal head. It is a ancient miniature, right? But convert your darlings, if I'm going to make a normative claim. In the middle, we see Warhammer Fantasy Battle regiments that look like they could be from the Heidelberg Fair down the street, combined with Astra Militarum heads, combined with Astra Militarum sort of like body armor, Space Marine hands, bolt pistols. What are they? Scouts. Yeah, they're scouts, but they're not, right? And one of the other things that I'm interested in exploring is the ways in which a community of practice insists on creates a kind of legibility. Because converting, despite the fact that I do it by myself late at night, is an intensely social act in that I am not just making any kind of sculpture, right? in this world where we can build whatever we want. We can 3D print whatever we want. What I want to make is the box of Space Crusade, right? And so this kind of act and its value to me is also its value to you, which is some sort of recognition. Even if that is a recognition of moving outside of what is possible or typical, as in the case in this third image, which is, of course, the dead Blood Angel Terminator from Space Hulk, actually the best Warhammer thing, but being carried by some kind of bitbox junk bot, right? What would I feel this as? I don't know, a Sentinel? And this will be another question, right? Proxying and counting as, which is not something we do at the hobby table, but it comes out of the hobby table and onto the game table, potentially. We'll talk about that more if time permits. Just how little action these guys have seen. I'm really inspired by, I guess not that recent anymore, but work on miniaturing, which my computer says is misspelled all the time because it's a new and exciting term, right? As a catch-all for collecting all the different things we do when we're doing stuff with miniatures, right? And Yaka has done some really great work on toys before she worked on this with the rest of the team, to think about what it's like to look at little things and appreciate their visual pleasure, but also just like basking in a kind of glow, which uses the term glow. And I'm thinking about all these different ways that we can engage with miniatures, and that we do, that can also involve not just, I'm going to make like this motion a lot, like I'm thinking about hands all the time. It's a very tactile, but also just like on our computers, right? Like if you look at pictures of miniatures, there's all kinds of ways in which we interact with them. But I'm trying to focus, again, I'm really trying to restrain myself, to think about this last point, right? The ways that rules or standards or, with the earlier panel, injunctions inform the way that we do this craft, that we do these practices, and that we make sense of them and hope or attempt to make them potentially understandable to others. Again, that kind of legibility. So there's a couple of different terms I want to talk about, right? Proxying, count as, and modeling for advantage, which is the name of the talk, but I could have picked any, right? And so one of the things that I'm interested, I don't know why I even printed this out. One of the things I'm interested in kind of getting into for a minute here, we're going to look at some examples, but I think this is a pretty good one, is to think about these different terms. I'm going to keep saying we. I'm assuming we're all somewhat practiced in these practices, even if it's much less often than we'd like, right? And this is what I heard in the sort of side talk before. How long has it been since you've painted? How long has it been since you've done this? I haven't glued anybody together this year, right? Like and it's always because we've moved, right? In this case, we redid the basement. It's very sad. But I'm going to assume we have some experience with this, and at least you've seen some discussions. I just want to be clear when I'm talking about proxy forces, I'm not talking about real world proxy forces, right? But rather this relationship between proxying and counting as being related but distinct kinds of ways of making sense of what miniatures are and how we construct them. And here I don't just mean gluing them together, but also how we like fill them with meaning and think about what they are. So is this a storm bolter? In some ways, well, first of all, it's a picture of a storm bolter, right? It's also, if we had it here, is you're chapping the clip correctly? No, storm bolter.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
As a storm bolter.
Okay, so is that a storm bolter?
Yes.
It might be the realest storm bolter we have access to, in that I could touch it, right? And then that still has some appeal to us, this visceral quality, this tactile. The body's going to come in a lot in this if I do it right. But of course, storm bolters also don't exist. And if they did, they couldn't work, right? People think it's the orcs who have unbelievable technology. A lot of it, there's a lot of it. And the reason I'm talking about this as a proxy is because even at the micro level of particular armaments, and this goes to another term that I neglected, you can imagine there's even room for it because of the layout. It should say WYSIWYG, right? What you see is what you get. This would count for WYSIWYG. Well, let's say we have a chaplain who's supposed to be equipped with it. That's a storm bolter. But it's also could be, we could count it as something else, right? And sometimes we do this at the table. That squad that looks like they have blast guns, can we call those auto guns just for the purpose of today? Fine. Can I count this whole army as something else? One of the ways we get into the difference between counting as and proxies is to think about one as being sort of temporary. And many of the ways in which community of players police these practices is by saying, well, if you just want to try something out, you can definitely count those as that. That is, I can proxy them for something else. This is why this might be acceptable, but it might not. Everything else looks pretty good. These Coke cans are kind of rough to look at, right? They don't really look like drop pods, but they're about the right size. And this is where things like true line of sight become really important, right? Unless they're the wrong size, and then we get into modeling for advantage. So why use the Coke cans? Well, drop pods are expensive. Maybe I'm just seeing how this works in a list. Is it cool if I run my army this way? And this I just pulled off the internet. I would never put a gray miniature on the table. And we'll talk about painting if there's time. Is this counting as? Is this proxying, right? The difference would be proxy often has the association of being just to check something out, just for now. Whereas counting as, and this is in general just from me reading the entire internet, is permanent and has sort of a higher status. This doesn't work.
That's the image of the day. Yeah.
Good thing we just had lunch. Now this is different. Okay? This would be something like counting as. These miniatures are not proxies because they seem permanent. What are they? Anyone have a guess?
Either wish counters or imperial agents, some kind of imperial agents. I can see.
I mean, are they legible is the question.
Dark Mechanica?
They sure are dark. So what these are, and I saw them in the chat, these are my brother's miniatures. I believe it's very early in Chicago, so thank you, Isaac, for joining us. But these are navigators. This is a navigator household with some human and near human agents. To me, to my eye, and I'm biased because it's my brother, but I think they read as 40K troops and may be dark, but there's enough wings to make me feel like they're imperial.
Yes. Yeah.
So the question my brother gets, these are old, by the way, I'm sure he's embarrassed, right? That he's moved on. But the question he often gets is, what do you run those as? What do you count those as? And running as is kind of maybe even a better term than counting as, because it gets to action, right? However, I mean, what's the answer? Well, it depends on the era, right? But I know initially graynets, but I also know that when you play in kind of the Inc. 28 sort of situation, you're doing like a modified simple necromunda. They're always flexible. Now, he can't do it incorrectly because they don't exist. But these models have to be about the right size and somehow also capture some aesthetic that the community can recognize to seem plausible. Why are that's the right choice? Well, in the decades since he made these, they've become the most powerful faction, a bad one, really popular, less popular, more expensive, less expensive. And so this sort of, it really matters when and how you interact with these miniatures, how we think about counting as an activity that isn't just a modeling activity, but is also combined with things like list making, meta chasing or ignoring, And now we can get into a kind of Bourdieuian sense of taste and distinction. Right? Because when my brother Isaac made these, Grey Knights were not very good. And so, rather than this being a bad decision, it seemed like a canny and sophisticated hobbyist approach to select something that is underpowered and esoteric to fit with a novel army, shutting down discussions of your dark mechanical army is Eldar. Oh, what a surprise, right? Why would you pick when Eldar were great, for example? And here we start to get into the ways in which thinking about what proxying and counting as count as could be training for some sort of event, or it could be an effort to, through your miniaturing, cast yourself as a particular kind of hobbyist and possible player. Now, I know he's played games with them, but not a lot, right? And many of us, especially myself, have whole armies where I've painstakingly followed an edition's rules that have never seen the tabletop and will never see the tabletop. But I keep maybe modifying just in case. Now, is that true? Not really. I don't think I actually want to play. Why then do I have to follow an army list, especially for an edition that I think will probably end pretty soon? It's almost impossible. And here we can think about the ways in which taste, judgment, discernment, and a kind of constraint of imagination can be pleasurable and a kind of play in itself. I love having this picture up behind me, so I don't want to sort of blast through it, but just to talk about WYSIWYG for a second in this context, right? And this is a term that I really blew past. I hate bringing up the lexicon. I mean, I thought Fiona did a good job using it because it's a storehouse of discussion yesterday, but one of the only places you can actually see people talking about WYSIWYG as being a rule is in the lexicon, not in any rule, right? It is not there. But in the I'm not saying that right. In this website, they describe it as the foundational rule of Warhammer 40,000, in that it's a one-to-one relationship between a miniature and a game object. That is, if I put a miniature on the table, this guy about to pull his sword out has to have a sword, right? And that you need to be able to look at it and understand what's going on. One of the reasons this is important is to understand, as an opponent, what you're facing, to not be surprised. This is why people get frustrated when you say, well, these guys who are blue have plasma guns, but these guys who are blue have pistols, and these guys who are blue, they're actually green. This starts to become kind of confusing, especially if you forget they're in play. WYSIWYG is also important because it allows us to have meaningful constraints, right? To have things look the way we want them to look. Things like grenades get complicated. Things like holstered pistols get complicated. Do we have to see them to think they're there? They start to fall apart when we get into this kind of more free converting. What is the WYSIWYG of the giant navigator's third eye? Is it a plasma pistol? Perhaps, right? Does it have no effect on the game? Perhaps. And these are the kinds of things that we need to negotiate. And just as we get out of this section, and I'm not going to take forever here, it is this negotiation that is a part of play and imagined play and possible. In the discussions of these kinds of rules that we see online, that we see in places like back in the day, DACA, or the Ammo Bunker, or now places like Reddit, and in real lives across the world, is it goes something like this. I have a force like this. Would you play against it? And someone will say, well, as long as it was WYSIWYG. And then someone else will say, if your opponent thinks that they can shoot your antenna, then you shouldn't play with that guy, right? They're a jerk. And it often comes down to this kind of idea about fairness and flexibility and intelligibility and recognizability. No one wants to play against a gray army that's not the army that it says it is. But people say things like, if it looked good, I'd play against it. And here we get into this sort of last rule, which is the rule of cool, right? And the rule of cool in this sense is the idea that, well, it works a lot of different ways. And I have another whole chunk on cool that I'm not ready to really talk about yet, but cool itself is like a fraught word, right? And we can think of, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Aaron Trummel's work on Black bodies in play, where he talks about the sort of history of cool and flexibility as being a particular African-American experience. But cool is loaded. But the rule of cool involves not just something looking cool, but you being cool about my stuff that looks cool, right? That it asks you to accept what I've done, or in this case, what my brother has done, because it's so obviously difficult, right? Or it just works. And that sense of overcoming rules and boundaries through a kind of shared appreciation of an action, of a practice, an aesthetic, is where we see the rule of cool allowing things like this navigator army, which otherwise you could see a pedant saying, they're the wrong size to be whatever you say they are. You know, that's not really the size of the box good enough there, a multi-headed object. I want to wrap up, but I just want to, instead of having a conclusion, I want to move out into a new avenue here. This is, as I said, I'm in the blue tack phase. It's no accident that these are bodies, right? And that I'm not talking about vehicles as much. I know vehicles are a big deal for some people, but I'm interested in the way in which when we miniature and when we convert and when we model, it's bodies working on bodies, which seems sort of just like obvious, but there's something to the way in which there's we think of the work of, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Louis Poincare, the sociologist who did a lot of sociology of sport and boxing, to think about a kind of carnal practice here in play, in which we are incarnate and we are using our bodies to make meaning. In this case, there's a sort of nice rhyming where we're using our bodies to make other bodies that have meaning. Here we see me hunched at the table. But I'm trying to think about how these bodies interact with the material of the miniatures itself. And in other work, my colleague Ian William and I have an article on Old Hammer in Games and Culture, where we talk a lot about some of these activities and about how bodies, making bodies are these kinds of practices. And we talk about metal there. I want to pivot to plastic. And I think there's something that we can really think about with plastic, especially those of us who've been doing this a long time. Because it's in the plastic and the manipulation of it. And particularly, and there you see my very thin modeling cement, right? Because the citadel stuff is terrible. But the way it interacts with the plastic and with my own converting practices at the table, we need to think about how the cement melts the plastic, allowing a kind of weld, which it seems to me is quite different than the pinning and supergluing and even green stuffing that comes out of a 80s heavy metal kind of metal tradition. And to really get into the sort of micro practices and experiences of working with the very specific materials, this would also allow us to think about things like resin as being different than plastic, and not take for granted that all these miniatures are all these miniatures. And especially when we have a kind of hybrid shape, like that lieutenant or captain I had who had a metal body and a plastic head. These are very, very small distinctions. But if we can't think about very, very small distinctions at a Warhammer conference, I don't know where we're going to go. And I have this book in the middle here because I picked this up at a bookstore when I was visiting my brother, actually. And this reader is fantastic for thinking about plastic. It's all about plastic and plasticity in a kind of very queer sense, and a rethinking sort of relation through plastics. And one of the things that the editors talk about is the way Barthes talks about plastic as being new, expanding, mobile, flexible, and somehow containing movement. And I think if we think about plastic and how it works, we can also think about that sort of possibility, while also thinking about things like, what does it mean to work with an extracted petrochemical kind of runoff? What does it mean to think about who makes these resin recasts we order from China or the Ukraine, right? What does it mean to use household detritus in your miniatures? The difference between having to use superglue versus modeling cement versus hot glue gun changes how we interact with these shapes and what kind of conversions we can do. And it means we have to think about chemistry, and it means that we have to think about sprues seriously, And also think about new production methods that not just Games Workshop, but especially Games Workshop uses in terms of 3D modeling. So we also, while we think about plastic, we always already have to think about ZMAX and different modeling, CAD, and also just to come back to assembly, that they first have to be printed in such a way that they can be flat packed in a box for us to then clip off and file, right? Or not file, and put together. And that's before we even drill our bolters. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.